Before I get into this week's introduction, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for the very kind and generous feedback following on from my interview with Eric Anders Lang. It's been a great week to receive that feedback. It's really comforting to know that you are listening and you are enjoying the content that I'm putting out. But the one thing that stood out for me was the content that Eric was able to put out in the last week. Obviously, the tragic circumstances surrounding George Floyd and everything that we've seen in the media. I think Eric's taken a real leadership stance in the content that he's put out, made a real statement on behalf of his belief and what he stands for, and also what we as a golf community should be considering when we're looking at how golf can be an agent and an advocate for change. And I think through the Random Golf Club, as we move into the future, that will be one of the vehicles that golf will be able to use to be the leader of everyone's welcome. So I just wanted to say thanks for that, and just to really highlight the great work that Eric's done in the following week. It's been amazing. On to this week's episode. Once again, you get the chance to meet people in golf that sometimes you don't think that you'll ever get the chance to meet. And some of the people that you meet sometimes may not necessarily be high-profile sports people or high-profile content creators or the like. They might just be normal people with a normal story. Well, sometimes the normal story is more than just a normal story. And once you peel back the layer, you find out a huge level of information that you might not have otherwise found out. And today's interview with a gentleman by the name of Mel Hughes is exactly that. Mel was introduced to me by my good friend John Cornish, and you'll hear from John in the podcast as well. I asked John to join us because John was introducing me to Mel. But Mel, how do I describe it? You can listen and describe it. But if I told you that I was interviewing someone who had launched rockets, flew at top gear, studied in Georgia, had played more rounds at Augusta than he can remember, and was a personal friend and confidant of Bobby Jones, you probably wouldn't believe me. Well, that's who we're going to hear from today. Mel Hughes has a wonderful backstory that covers all of those topics that I just mentioned there, and it's a story that you really have to hear to believe. It's one of the podcast where you just sit back, turn on the earphones and relax, have a cup of tea, have a coffee, and just listen to someone who has such a broad and varied depth of exposure and experience into this wonderful game of golf. I really enjoyed recording this. It was just, for me, it was just sitting back listening, and I enjoy hearing stories like this. And to be able to meet someone like Mel and to hear that, who we might not have ever heard of before. Maybe this is the first time that Mel's story has been told. Maybe someone will listen to it and pass it on, and maybe he'll get a chance to tell that story somewhere else as well. I really did enjoy recording this episode. I've actually made it into two parts because it was just so hard to wrap it up. I didn't want to wrap it up, So Mel had a lot of information to share. So I'm going to release it in two parts. The first part is about an hour long, and the second part about 45 minutes. So I'll put them at pretty close. But today's the first part of my interview with Mel Hughes. Thanks again for the feedback. Jump over to iTunes, leave us a review, leave us a message, leave us a like, a share, all of that stuff that you've been doing. I really do appreciate it. And I'll just keep plugging away at these podcasts. I'm really enjoying it. And thanks for listening. Until next time, I'll speak to you soon. Now, John, I said in my introduction that you were kind enough to introduce Mel as a potential guest on the podcast, and it just seemed a no-brainer for us to let that chat happen. I might let you take over for a little bit and just have a chat to Mel and tell us about how you guys know each other, because it's a great story and a random, just one of those random golf meeting stories that we all love, and we've all got our own. So tell us how you guys got together.
Yeah, well, golf is one of those pastimes that affords you the opportunity to meet so many people. You get a great cross section of society, not only from your own country but from other countries as well. and especially golf travel, of which I'm very interested in. I've traveled quite a lot to play golf in different parts, and every now and again you come across people that just have amazing life stories, and obviously you can learn a lot more from other people than you can teach, and you and the sum total of that is, I guess, your total knowledge of life and experiences. And Mel and I met probably 7, 8, 9 years ago when Mel was traveling. Mel was down in Victoria, and he was, at the time we were at Barwon Heads Golf Club, and I was with another American friend who was out traveling. And as a 2-ball, we were on the first tee, and one of the guys in the shop came over and asked if a single could join us. Of course, yeah, come along for the ride. And over the next 4 hours, we played some golf, and we got to know Mel. And every now and again, Mel would pull out an oversized camera and would take some photos of things that interested him, and that became part of the conversation as well. So through a chance meeting, built a friendship with somebody who has a common interest in golf, but also has other interests, and really has an amazing life story to tell as well. And that's, when we were talking a month or so ago, Roscoe, about your podcast, and I am an avid listener to it, and I enjoy listening to a lot of the stories that people have to tell. And I thought, there's this guy that I know who has an amazing history in golf. He's got he's had a fairly amazing career. He has a passion for photography as well, which is not something that I necessarily share, but it's but I know a lot of your previous guests have enjoy those types of media pursuits.
Yep.
And Mel just happens to bring all that together into one neat package sitting over there in Denver.
So, Mel, what was your recollection of that first day down there at Barwon Heads meeting John?
Well, it was very similar. When I went in, I asked the pro if there were any issues about taking photographs, because I'm an avid photographer. And with my travels over the years, I've probably accumulated, approaching 100,000 images from the world's top golf courses. And there are some clubs, even some commercial ones, that react negatively to cameras. Shadow Creek in Las Vegas is one that hates cameras. It's interesting, Augusta National doesn't, but Shadow Creek does. So I asked the pro if it would be possible to play by myself, because you never know if you're going to be with somebody who's riding in a cart and they race out in front of you, and then you're trying to take pictures, and it does slow down the game a bit. So I just asked the pro if I could play alone. He said no. He said he could put me off on the backside, but it was going to be very slow, and because of a tournament. And he said it'd be quicker to start on the front, but there was a 2-ball, and I said, fine. I said, as long as they don't mind me taking pictures. And he goes, oh, they'll be fine. It's a local and and a guest from America. So we joined up, and I begged their forgiveness, and we were all walking, so I didn't have to worry about them getting out in front of me with a cart. So we played, and had a great time talking with John and his friend Trey, who's from Mississippi and or Alabama, I forget now, Mississippi, I believe. And we just stayed in touch, and John's been in the States a number of times where we've been able to get together and play golf. And so, as John said, it's just it's a great game for friendships, and it's hard to have a conversation playing tennis. And I think one of the great things about golf is that I'm an avid table tennis player too, and you can't really have a conversation and play table tennis, and so golf is a great way to spend 4 or 5 hours with people in an environment where you can have a conversation.
Mel, I'd like to spend most of our time, or all of our rest of our time, talking about your story, but let's talk about that golf that you experienced that day. Barwon Heads, what drew you to Barwon Heads to go and play?
Well, in my work in the aerospace and defense industry with Lockheed Martin, I was president of a group of companies, and we had some extensive contracts in Australia. So I had been there on work probably every 3 or 4 months for a number of years. And I was just And I started the quest to play the world's top 100 courses when I was asked about it by one of the vice presidents that worked for me back in 1997 or so. And so I knew the list existed, but I never really paid attention to them. So I got to looking at it, and that coupled with the annual trip I took to Scotland and Ireland and England and Wales, I had played quite a few of them. And as I'm sure we'll get into, I'd already played Augusta. So, it just became something I was doing, and my work took me all over the world. And it was, and you can't work 7 days a week. So, we would have downtime and schedule golf. And that's what I was doing. I was there, with work, but, trying to play golf. And Barwon Heads was just one of the courses that I hadn't played. And you look at various lists, and it was on the list of nice courses. And so I went down to play it and walked out to the first tee, and there's John Cornish.
And did Barwon Heads, did it meet your expectations? Did it live up to its reputation? It's personally one of my favourites down here in Victoria, but did it? And you won't offend me if it didn't, but...
Well, the setting is certainly beautiful, and I enjoyed the course and the conversation. And we went into town, and John, now his wife, is his girlfriend at the time, Kay, joined us, and the four of us had a very pleasant lunch, glass of wine. And so it was just the whole experience throughout that day. It's hard for me to separate the course. I mean, it's not any threat to the world's top 100, but it was a very nice course and a very beautiful setting. And to me, golf, it's not religious, but I will say it is spiritual. And so these occasions when you have nice weather and an enjoyable course and a great conversation and a couple glasses of wine thrown in, and it's hard to beat the experience. So yes, it lived up to my expectations.
Beautiful. Now, when John introduced you to me, he said that your career was in, I'll just broadly summarize it, in the world of flying, and also golf. And for me as a young person, I was one of these guys, and you've probably had numerous people tell you a story like this, but I wanted to be a pilot. I was lucky enough to have family in Scotland, so from a very early age, had the ability to go and visit family in Scotland. So as a young boy growing up in country New South Wales, I was one of the first kids in town that had ever been on a 747, back in the 70s, going to, I think it was maybe a 3 or 4 leg journey back then. So I was always infatuated by flight. Golf came later. So if I asked you to introduce yourself in terms of your career and some of the background, how would you describe that?
Well, I was always interested in aviation, and I was born in 1946, so I was 9 or 10 years old when the space program first got started with the Redstone rockets, and then when they selected the first Mercury astronauts, and I realized that people were going to space, I was hooked. And I've been a space cadet every moment since then. My son was a very good student, but struggled with what he wanted to do in life. And it was hard for me to help him because from the age of 8 or 9 or 10, I knew I wanted to be in the space business in one way or another. My brother was very sick. And so the family, my mother and brother and I had to move to Florida to get him in more stable weather than the Northeast Arkansas climate that we were in. And my dad bought an airplane to start flying from Blytheville, Arkansas to Pompano Beach, Florida. And I spent the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades actually in Florida. And so I started flying. In fact, I had my private pilot's license before I had my driver's license. And so by the time I went into the Navy after graduating, getting out of graduate school at Georgia Tech, I had probably 1,000 hours flying at that point. And so I was very much interested in being a Navy pilot and test pilot, and then being an astronaut. And I got into the interviews at NASA, but I thought I was too young and not as experienced as some of the other candidates. And I got frustrated with the Navy, and so left and then joined Martin Marietta. But so my start with aviation was for the desire to go to space. In fact, if NASA called me this afternoon and asked me would I like to go on a one-way trip to Mars, I'd leave tomorrow morning.
Yeah, right. So in that career, what were some of the the more, I guess, intriguing things. What were some of the experiences that you had in your naval career and then, your aerospace career?
Well, I graduated from Georgia Tech and with several degrees in engineering, and I had signed up into the Navy. And of course, this was during the Vietnam War, so I was going in the military one way or another. But obviously, Navy flight school was what I was interested in, and I picked the Navy over the Air Force because I met John Young, who was the Apollo astronaut, and he was a Navy pilot and graduate of Georgia Tech, and he said that landing on an aircraft carrier was spectacularly difficult. And so after leaving Georgia Tech, I started the Navy flight school, and because of the education I had and all the hours I had, I think I'd had the highest student grade for that year in the Naval flight school. And so they let me pick where I wanted to go. And so I went to VX-5, which is an experimental test squadron in China Lake, California. And so my first 3 years as an operational pilot was actually as a test pilot, flying weapon system test missions. We weren't flying new airplanes, but we were flying and developing the tactics for weapon systems. And from there, I went to several attack squadrons, mostly flying A-7s, and aboard the USS Enterprise, and had, I don't know, something around 500 carrier landings, and got a chance to go to the fighter weapons school that people know as Top Gun, and from there, when it became obvious I wasn't going to, or at least the odds of becoming an astronaut were pretty small, I decided that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in the Navy. And so it's like a game of poker. They raised the bet, because up to then everything I had done in my life was focused on trying to be an astronaut. And I had the basic qualifications. It was such a select group that picking 10 people out of hundreds of millions, it's a tough cut. And I just decided I didn't want to be in the Navy the rest of my life, and if I didn't make an astronaut, I knew I would stay in the Navy as a career, and that's not what I wanted to do. So I left and went back and actually worked for my dad for 2 years building houses back in Blytheville, Arkansas, and was contacted by Martin Marietta in Denver, and I came out here in July of 1980 and started a career in aerospace and defense, and as a manager of system engineering on the Peacekeeper intercontinental ballistic missile system, and then chief engineer on the small ICBM. Then I ran Titan II and Titan IV space launch vehicle programs. Titan IV was the largest rocket in the world at that time. And then I ran business development organization in there, and was sent down to Arizona to be president of that operating company. And there's not a lot I can say about that because it was classified work, but the company invented synthetic aperture radar, which is a very sophisticated sensor that is used in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And from there, I was the CEO and president and chief operating officer of a couple different aerospace startups. And in parallel with that, started my own consulting business, which I continue to this day. In fact, I just finished 2 days of, in fact, we had to delay this podcast 2 days because I had, design review and telecons with British Aerospace in the last couple of days, all virtual because of the virus. Yeah. But yeah, I'm one of these. I love what I do and work, and I can't imagine not doing it. And, I don't like gardening. And so I'd be quite content to die at work. But, I've worked on some of the country's most intriguing space and science programs. In fact, Titan IV had 41 vehicles and 40 missions, and the only unclassified mission we launched Cassini to Saturn. And so when you're building $300 million rockets, launching multi-billion-dollar spacecraft to Saturn, or national security overhead assets for the country, it's hard to give that up as long as you can contribute to the country's national security in something that is intellectually challenging to me. It's hard to turn down. Plus, it gave me an opportunity to travel the world, which was if you will, an airline ticket to any golf course that I wanted or could, try to get on.
Well, In your career wise, who would be the most interesting people that you've met? Is there anyone that, in terms of names, that we would recognise that you've had the occasion to spend some time with, and just experience that might interest us all?
Well, been a number. I mean, although, my I started golf because my dad, who did not play golf, but was one of the people that helped found the little country club in Blytheville, Arkansas, and we lived out near it, and in a little town of 15,000 people that are all cotton farmers or soybean farmers. And my dad was in construction, had a company that built streets and roads and houses and airbase runways and that sort of stuff, interstate highways and overpasses. There wasn't a lot to do. And so there was a golf course out there. And so I took up golf at age 6 or 7. Turned out I had a little talent for it. And so I'd come home from school and go to the golf course. And so I was taught by a couple of pros, Fred Bedford and George Teal. In fact, George was interesting in that he was Chichi Rodriguez's godfather from Puerto Rico. And so I met Chichi in the early 60s. And the only sponsor he had was Aero Shirt Company. And he was playing on the tour in long sleeve white dress shirts because that's the only shirts they would give him. So I remember he would come to Blytheville, a week before the Memphis tournament and stay with George, and they'd work on his game. And I played with him every day. In fact, he finished 3rd or 4th or 5th in the tournament. And there was a lot of pressure on him because he had, I think he had to finish like in the top 10 to make enough money to send money back home to his family and then have enough money to eat. And he lived on red beans and rice. And this was long before he was a household name, but he had all these trick shots and he was quite a showman. But then I was introduced to and started taking lessons from Bob Toski. And he was at the Ocean Reef Club in North Key Largo, Florida, and then the Old Baldy Club in Saratoga, Wyoming. And that relationship allowed me to meet, and play with Arnold Palmer and Jack Nicklaus and Gary Player and a number of other pros that, obviously I would have not had any access to
What
whatsoever.
What age were you when this was all happening? How old were you, when you're playing or getting coached with and working alongside Bob Toski, and he's introducing you to some of the the greatest names in golf?
I was probably 11 the first time I took lessons. We flew down to Ocean Reef, and my dad went a couple of times, and then they would just put me on an airplane, and I'd fly to Miami, and the club would fly a little airplane up to the Miami airport, pick me up, and fly me down to the resort where Bob was, and I would stay with him or in the hotel, depending on what was going on at his house, and take lessons for a week or two. I mean, it wasn't just a lesson and leave. This was, in residence. And I remember my first lesson. My dad was there, and Bob told me to go out to the tee, and he said, there's a tree out there with a black and white X on a little sign painted on a tree. He said, hit irons toward that X. And it was, for me, it was about a 5-iron shot. And I was sitting there hitting 5 irons, and I was hitting the ball very well. And they were all falling kind of at the base of the tree or in the close proximity. And I was honestly thinking, how impressed Bob was going to be in my game. And Bob finally came out to the tee and watched me hit a few balls. And he said, do you play any other sports? And I said, not really. My dad made me quit football, and I hurt my ankles playing basketball, and I'm not very good at baseball. I said, during the winter, I bowl some. He said, I think you ought to spend more time bowling because I don't think you have any future in golf. Turned around and walked off the tee back to the pro shop. So I hit a few more balls and realized he wasn't coming back. So I went back into the pro shop and asked Bob, I said, well, are we going to have a lesson? And I was a precocious 11 or 12-year-old. And he said, well, we can. He said, but I need to understand if you're willing to do what I ask you to do. And I said, well, we flew all the way from Arkansas to Florida. I'm obviously here to learn. But he had recognized just in a conversation in the pro shop that I had an ego and an attitude. And so he had to prick that balloon before he even started. And what I think has made him possibly the greatest instructor of golf in the history of the game is his ability to communicate. He knows the game and he knows what he has to change in what order, but he's able to communicate that in a way that very, very few people are able to. And so he pricked my ego and exploded it, in a space of about 60 seconds. And from there on, we were great friends. But the first few minutes of our meeting were traumatic, to say the least.
What an introduction to the world of learning golf and getting better at golf to learn that lesson so young. It's what a great story. And Bob Toski, Sheep is a World Golf Teachers Hall of Fame. You could spend an hour talking about what that man's achieved in his world.
He showed me pictures when he won the World Championship, and stories about Al Besselink and there are days that, Gary Player would be on the end of the tee and he'd help me, and then he'd help some 70-year-old lady that was just learning golf and walk down to one of the greatest ball strikers in the world. And he just transitioned from one of those to the other. And I can remember being at the Masters with him. He got me a job in the tower of the 18th hole, and this is before cell phones. And I had these, Augusta National had these wonderful binoculars. And my job was to sit there and watch who was walking up the 18th fairway. So, and of course, there were no electronics. And so I'd write on a piece of paper, it's Don January and Bob Golby in this group, and hand it to Toski and everything for the TV broadcast. And I actually saw Ben Hogan shoot 36-30 at Augusta. Wow. And yet he was so unhappy. He went to the range and started hitting balls and was out there with car lights on the driving range. And this is back before the ball machines. And so his caddy was out there with the bag. And I was sitting there with Toski. And of course, I was too young to drink. I was in college at Georgia Tech at the time, but I think I wasn't 21. And Bob said, "Close your eyes and listen." And so I did. And as Hogan hit the ball, you realize not only was the trajectory of every shot the same, and not only did these 4 irons land within 2 or 3 feet, it seemed like, every shot he hit, but they all sounded the same. He was making such pure contact. So, I met Mark McCormick walking around. I saw Nicholas shank a ball on number 12 and still make par. And then he eagled 13. And Toski asked me, "What would you have done?" I said, "Well, after shanking it, I've been so embarrassed. I'd have tugged it over the green, chipped it on 2 or 3 putted, so double, triple bogey. And then I'd been so mad I would have at least made 6 or 7 on 13. And Nicholas went 3-3, and he said, and Mel would have gone 6-6 or 6-7. I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I think you need to focus on aerospace and not on golf." So
that was one of those sliding doors moments, I guess. No, Mel, I'm more blown away by these stories than I ever could imagine. You mentioned the Masters, and you've had a whole load of experience there. But you mentioned Georgia Tech. Now, we know Georgia Tech is producing some great golf talent. What did Georgia Tech mean for you in playing on the golf team there, and what was the opportunity that gave you?
Well, Georgia Tech for me, first and foremost, was an education. I went to college to get educated because my goal was not to play on the PGA Tour. My goal was to become an astronaut. And so my dad had graduated from Georgia Tech as an architect. And so it's a wonderful engineering school that I think is ranked around 4th in the world now in both undergraduate and graduate schools. And so it was a wonderful school. It was in the South, only 500 or so miles from the airport in Memphis. And I lived just about 70 miles north of Memphis. So the selection of Georgia Tech was, 1, my dad could help me get in. 2, it was a great engineering school. It was close to home. The weather was nice. And they offered me a partial golf scholarship. And so it was just a combination of events. I thought I was pretty smart. I'd made really good grades in high school. I got to Georgia Tech and I found out what smart was. And it was not Mel from Blytheville, Arkansas, I can assure you. And so Georgia Tech for me, even though I wound up with graduate degrees, was a struggle, particularly in the beginning. And so we played golf, and I played on the amateur circuit during the summer, but it was late summer before my game came around, because unlike my friends, say at the University of Georgia, that were majoring in real estate or physical education, I was majoring in plasma gas dynamics, and taking statistical thermodynamics and nonlinear partial differential equations and those sort of things. And the class would be 6 people, and they would be, a couple of Americans, a couple from China, a couple from India, and a lot of them were, obviously, transplants from their country, and they were there for one purpose, to learn. So they didn't have any other distractions, and they were brilliant. And so the classes were very challenging. I mean, one to keep up. And so I think what I learned at Georgia Tech more than anything was just accomplishing something that at times you just said, this does not make any sense, and just working through it. And golf was something I did. I was passionate about it, and I played number 1 for 3 years and was captain a couple of years. So, I was a good player, but it wasn't the driving influence that maybe other people had had. In fact, I had 1 year qualified for the U.S. Amateur. I was in Washington, D.C. It was 36 holes, and I wound up being the medalist. And so there was a reporter there, and I was a sheltered Arkansas kid. I didn't know anything about reporters. And he asked me, and back then, if you said you wanted to be a professional, you were one. And so you had to be very careful about stating your professional. And he just asked me, he said, did I have those aspirations? And I said, no, not really. I would really prefer to be an astronaut and than a professional golfer. And so the next day in the Washington Post, there was a story that basically, with big headlines, said, "Man from Mars wins amateur qualifier," or something like that. And the rest of the story was just hammering me over the fact that I was taking up a spot from somebody who wanted to make golf their career, and that I should have not even been in the qualifying tournament if I had any decency about me. And I was had a meeting scheduled because of graduate school in the Navy's flight school schedule. It turned out, I thought I was going right after, undergraduate school, going right in the Navy. And it turned out that it was going to be 2 years before I would start, the flight school. And it turned out that they could delay my start from the date they gave me by 3 or 4 months. I could finish, a master's or PhD program at Georgia Tech. And the Navy recruiter said he couldn't do anything about it. So I had my dad from Arkansas. He just wrote a letter to Senator McClellan and Senator Fulbright and asked them, could they do anything? And never heard back from them. And then one day I was at Tech and I got a note in my mailbox, and there was a registered or certified letter, and it's from the Navy, and it was from this recruiter. And he asked me to call him at this number. And so I called him, and he said, well, I've got a letter here. He said, it's from the Chief of Naval Operations, and it says your flight school date has been moved 4 months or 5 months or whatever it was. And but now your acceptance into the flight program is contingent upon you finishing, your graduate education. He said, what is all of this about? And I told him, well, we wrote a letter to the 2 senators. And so anyway, I had this meeting to go see them and thank them for interceding on my behalf. And when I got there, they both, had the newspaper. And I said, well, there's nothing could be further than the truth. I'm an avid golfer, and passionate about what I do. It's just that I don't want to be a professional golfer. And so I remember Senator Fulbright saying, well, the next time you read something ugly about one of us, he said, just keep this in mind. He said, everything you read in the Washington Post is not necessarily the truth. So
another great lesson.
Yes.
Another great lesson. So At Georgia Tech, Mel, I believe that, that was your way, or that was how you were introduced to Augusta. Obviously,
Yes.
it's just the weekend past where Augusta, where we would have expected to be on. So it's fresh in all of our minds and hearts that, we all missed Augusta. You had this amazing experience and time, being in and around that environment on what I understand is a fairly frequent and regular basis with a pretty high degree of access. So what was that like? How did that eventuate and come about?
Well, I had my car broken into, and they stole a tachometer and a camera I had in the back seat, and I got a check from the insurance company that came to me instead of my dad. I think at that point I was over 18, so technically it had to come to me. But and the check was for $1,800. And Atlanta Athletic Club, which at that time had East Lake, which originally was 36 holes, and then they sold 18 and became, high density housing. And then the East Lake that everyone is familiar with now was the golf course. And that was one of the courses that Georgia Tech played our golf matches. So I knew the head pro there, a wonderful man named Harold Sargent. And they were building a new facility in Duluth, which is, where the facility is now, the 36 holes. It's had the U.S. Open, the PGA, and the Women's U.S. Open on the other course. And it's a wonderful facility. And they were building all that, and they decided to sell East Lake. And they sold the downtown club, the Atlanta Athletic Club, and they sold, there was another club, and they downsized the Lake Club. But anyway, they were looking for young members. And so I had played golf with Charlie Harrison and Richard Waters, who were really quite renowned amateur golfers in the southern United States. And they said, well, we'll write your recommendation. You ought to join the athletic club. And so I did, and it was $1,200. It's probably $65,000 now, but it was $1,200, and I joined the Atlanta Athletic Club. So even when the golf team wasn't out there, I got to know Harold Sargent, and they built a trophy room for Bobby Jones trophies. In fact, one of the trophies they had was the ball he holed out with at all four majors in 1930 is on display in this one. It's like a candelabra, but with four little slots. And the ball he holed out with in all four of the tournaments is there. In the letter he wrote the USGA, reminding them that the U.S. Open had never been held at a tournament in a site south of the Mason-Dixon line, saying that he was sure the USGA would correct that at some point. And when they decided to correct it, he'd like to recommend the Atlanta Athletic Club to be that facility. And then in 1976, we had the U.S. Open there. Jerry Pate won. So Harold Sargent had told me that I'd been asking about Bobby Jones because of the trophy room. And he said, well, he was a good friend of the family. He said, I'll introduce you one day. And I didn't press the matter. He said, I don't know when it'll be. And in fact, I think he said, don't bug me about it, but it'll happen. But just one day out of the blue, our golf coach came up to me and said, have you ever met Bobby Jones? And I said, no, but, Mr. Sargent says that he's going to introduce me one of these days, but I've never met him. And he said, well, you may have a chance to meet him. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, that's all I know, and that's all I can tell you. You may have a chance to meet him one day. I said, through the school? And he said, yes, through the school. So it was probably a month later, I got a note again in my mailbox, and it said that Coach Dodd wanted to see me. This is Bobby Dodd, the guy that the Georgia Tech football stadium's named after, and he, like Bear Bryant, is an icon of Southern football. And, golfers did not go see Bobby Dodd. I mean, that was just unheard of. And so I thought, well, gee, I haven't been playing that bad, So, but to keep up, that one of the things they gave me was tutors. And so basically for every hour I was in class, I had an hour of tutoring just because I was gone so much that I needed that to keep up. And so I went in there, and he asked me, he said, first question out of the box, he said, nice to meet you. I never met him before, and he said, have you ever met Bobby Jones? And I said, no, but you're the second person that's asked me that in the last month. And he said, well, you're going to have an opportunity. And he said, and given with your tutors and as much as you're gone, he's going to ask you something that I'm not sure you have time to do, but it's your decision to make. He said, but I want you to know how important he is to this school, to this state, and to the country. And at that point, I didn't realize it, but the only person in the history of Earth to have 2 New York ticker tape parades was Bobby Jones. And I said, well, what's going to happen? He said, well, he'll contact you, and it's for him to talk to you about. He said, it's a serious offer. Take it seriously. If you want to do it, do it. If you don't, or don't think you have the time, don't. And there's no repercussions, but don't blow this off, young man. And I said, he didn't use those words. Those are contemporary words, but he said, don't ignore this. And it was like another month, and my roommate was a football player, and I came in, and there was just a note that said, call Mr. Jones, and there was a telephone number. And it was and I did not connect the dots. And so I called the number, and the lady said, oh, yes, Mr. Jones is expecting your call. And when she answered the phone, she rattled off a name, it's like Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner, and Smith, a law firm.
Yeah.
And so this voice comes on a speakerphone, and he said, Mel? And I said, yes, sir. And he said, hi, this is Bobby. And it took me a second to process it. Mr. Jones, Bobby, I'm talking to Bobby Jones. And then all, the other 2 conversations came back into my mind. And I said, yes, sir, it's nice to talk with you. And he was very to the point. He said, I don't know if you know it, but I'm in a wheelchair. And of course, I'm a smart ass. And so I said, well, I think everybody in America knows that, Mr. Jones, and we're all very sorry. And I said, Mr. Sargent, has spoken to me about some of the physical difficulties, you've had and will continue to have with, I can't pronounce it, but it's syringomyelia, syringomyelia, syringomyelia. It's very difficult to say, but it's a neurological problem. You get fluid cavities in your spinal cord, and it causes pain and then paralysis, and very similar to ALS in the symptoms, but he was losing control of his body. And so he laughed and said, well, he didn't think that was true. He said, but that he didn't much care for nurses. And so what he was proposing was that I would come to his house, and my job would be to lift him out of his wheelchair and put him in bed. And he said he went to bed between 8:30 and 9 at night. And I needed to be there, no later than 8 o'clock, just to ensure there was an overlap. And that the cook stayed there, but the cook was unable to lift him, and his wife, Mary, was unable to lift him. And the kids were grown at that time and not in the house. And so he said he had a bedroom I could sleep. He said, if you're tired from golf, or, it's been a long day in a lab or whatever, you can sleep. I've got a study you can study, TV and radio. He said, I'm still a practicing attorney, and I'm working on briefs, but, sometimes I won't have much to do, and we can talk. And he said, the cook will stay here till you get here, and she'll fix for dinner whatever you want to eat. And if you can be here at 5:30, you can eat with the family. And they called us the boys. I was one of the boys. And he said, we always set a place for the boys. So if you come at 5:30, you'll eat with the family. And he said, but the cook will stay here to fix whatever you want when you get here. And he said, and the pay is $5 a night. And he said, would you be willing to help me? And I said, well, sure. And as it turned out, I was going to the athletic club to practice, because the practice facilities, the balls were brand new. And instead of going to Eastlake, I would drive to Duluth, and coming back to the Georgia Tech campus, I'd have to come through the Buckhead, West Paces Ferry area of Atlanta, which is his house, was very near the governor's mansion at the time. And so if I was in town, I was kind of the go-to guy, because the other people that did it were friends of the family, and they tend to be down toward Emory and Decatur, south. And that was a long drive through Atlanta. And So I started, I guess, in 1967, did it for several years. And it was quite an experience. I obviously knew about the Grand Slam. I didn't know about, the 4-iron he hit out of a sandy waste area on the 17th hole at Royal Lytham that so unnerved his opponent that he wound up winning. Yeah. And quite frankly, had so much homework to do, and it was so competitive in the classes that I would come there, have a sandwich, and I needed to get to homework, because I had they arranged my schedule to be, class in the morning, and then in the afternoon I was expected to go to the golf course. And we didn't get hurt like football players, but it was the amount of time that golf took, practice and playing, and then chipping and putting, and the expectations of us were that we put in the time, on the golf team. And so I didn't have a lot of spare time. Yeah. And so it's one of the regrets of my life that I didn't engage him more in conversation than I did. But this was 1967. This is, Vietnam was raging, and the Students for Democratic Society, SDS, and the Weather Underground was going on. And so he was much more, he wasn't watching, soap operas on TV. He was a brilliant man, a man of letters. He wrote and thought elegantly. And so he was interested in current events, and what was going on the Tech campus, because, he'd graduated from Georgia Tech and then got a degree in literature from Harvard, and then went to Emory Law School. And his dad was a lawyer and always wanted him to be a lawyer. And so when he retired in 1930 at the age of 28, it wasn't really a paying job, and he was as famous as anybody could get. But he had a family to support, and so he was a lawyer, and that's what he did and what he became. But it's one of life's regrets that I didn't engage him in more conversations. But even the first night I was there, he asked me, had I ever played Augusta? And I said, no, actually I haven't. I've been there a bunch of times because of my relationship with Bob Tosky. And of course, back then, Augusta was still a very private club, but it's not like it is today. I use the word in love, but it's almost like a shrine. I mean, it's, every golfer on the earth knows about it and wants to go there. And it's very, seriously restricted. And back then you just couldn't walk up and play, but it wasn't quite what it is today. And he said, well, you can go anytime you want to play. And he said, you can't spend money, and you'll be treated like a member, and you be my guest. And this was like a Wednesday night or Thursday. I said, well, I couldn't be there before Saturday afternoon. I said, I have a physics lab every Saturday morning from 8 to 12, 4 hours. And such was the life of someone studying aerospace engineering, because all the football and basketball players were industrial management, and I was taking plasma physics, which was just unbelievable. But as luck would have it, the next day they canceled my physics lab. And so all of a sudden, then I could leave after my classes on Friday. So I jumped in my car, and of course there's no cell phones, and had to stop and get gas. And I called the club and said, by the way, instead of coming tomorrow afternoon, I'm coming right now. Is that okay? And they said, absolutely fine. We'll be ready. And so I got there. It's I don't know, Augusta's probably 120 miles from Atlanta. And I got there in the afternoon, and the pro was waiting and said, I saved a caddy for you. You want to play? And he said, you'll be the only player on the course. And I said, course, absolutely. Let's go. So we headed out, and another interesting story, we got to the 5th hole, and I hit a tee shot, and we're walking up the fairway, and you look up toward the green, and there's a maintenance cart sitting in front of the green. And there was a guy that was working, they had a tarp out to the side, and the grass had been cut out, very precisely. Once we got up there, you could see how precise it had been cut. And then the dirt had been dug and put on the tarp along with the grass. And this guy was working on, obviously, a broken sprinkler head. But he had his half his chest was down in this hole as we walked up, and it was just the two of us, and it startled him and everything. And he came out of that hole like a bolt of lightning, and looked at me just with a look of astonishment, and wiped his hands on his pants, stuck out his hand and said, "Mr. Hughes, welcome to Augusta National." Now, this is a guy working on a broken sprinkler. I'm there 24 hours earlier than I'm supposed to be. And he knew who I was and shook my hand and called me by name. And so we're leaving with the caddy and headed to number 6. And I said, "How is it possible that he knows who I am?" He said, "Well, there are not many members here at all." He said, "So having somebody here is, it's very few number of people." And he said, and I said, "But I'm not a member. I'm just a guest." He said, "Oh, Mr. Hughes," he said, "you're better than a member. You're Mr. Jones's guest." And that's when I started to realize that, I was in uncharted territory for a young college kid, that I didn't even begin to appreciate, the situation I was in. And we got to number 9, and another story, when we were walking up, the caddy said, "He's not supposed to be here." And I said, "Why? He's got to work on the sprinkler." He said, "Yeah, but they're not allowed to work on the golf course around the members." And that's when I said, "Well, I'm not a member." And he said, "No, you're better than a member." And so we were walking up the 9th, and the caddy goes, "Uh-oh." And I go, "What?" And he said, "You see that guy standing on the back of the 9th green? And there's this very thin, very tall man in a green jacket." And I said, "Yeah, who's that?" He said, "That's Cliff Roberts." And he said, "You do not want to piss him off. Even as a friend of Bobby Jones, that's not a healthy thing to do." So he wanted to know, and it couldn't have been nicer, but wanted to know what I wanted for dinner, what time I was going to eat dinner, and what time I was going to get up. I was going to play 18 or 36, and what time was breakfast. And of course, I was just saying, "Well, how about I get up when I wake up? What time's that going to be?" And I realized I was not going to disengage from him until I gave him the specifics he was looking for. It was like, "Well, we'll finish up here at 6:30 or something, and I'll take a shower." And I'd been told to bring a jacket, so I did have a sport coat, and I said, "So I'm gonna be at dinner at 7. He said, "Fine." He said, "What time do you want to get up for breakfast?" And I realized I was going to have to give him time. I said, "How about 7:30? He said, "That'd be fine." "You know what you want for breakfast?" I said, "No, I don't eat breakfast." "Well, you got to eat breakfast. You can't play 36 holes around here without eating breakfast." And he said, I'd recommend the corned beef hash." He said, "It's the best thing on the menu in the morning. And then the pimento cheese sandwiches at lunch when you make the turn is what you want. And dinner is just whatever you want." But so and so I was awoken at 7:30, and it was Cliff Roberts waking me up, so it was like I was smothered with attention. And I won't say that I was ever 100% comfortable in that situation. And I know they were watching. I always felt like I was being watched, and the situations wherein they knew when I left there where I was headed. And they were afraid that if they did or said anything wrong, that I might convey that to Mr. Jones, and that, he would be unhappy with them. So they watched me, but it quite frankly was somewhat of an uncomfortable feeling. But I did that for several years as one of the boys. And every night next to his bed, there would be a crisp $5 bill. And I was a poor college student. I didn't need the $5, but it was kind of quaint,
It's I'm actually quite emotional listening to that story, Mel. It's unbelievable that what an experience. I'm not sure.
I just wish I had been more
I can understand.
Self-aware. If I could go back, like I said, my brother was very, very sick. If I could go back, I would fix that, and my mom and dad had a good relationship, and I had a very happy childhood, but my brother could have been more healthy, would have been a nice thing. But on a pretty short list of things I would do over, would be to go back and more fully appreciate the opportunity to sit and talk with him about life. And I heard rumors about him walking off St. Andrews. I didn't ask him about that. I didn't ask him about what it felt like to get the key to the city. I didn't ask him about what it was like to be in a New York ticker tape parade. I just.
Did you discuss his wins? His 4 wins in that one particular year of the Opens and the on the US and British soil as an amateur?
Yeah, I did bring that up because that's one thing I did know, and he was so humble about it all. It was just, it was kind of, that was a long time ago, and I was a good player, and I had a lot of demons. He was a very emotional club thrower, and he said I had to learn to not just play the course but control my emotions, and he said I was torn because I had a family to take care of, and even though I had a lot of notoriety, if you will, Madison Avenue didn't exist anything like it does today. I mean, if a sports figure repeated something equivalent to what Bobby Jones did in 2020, I mean, they would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And so he had New York ticker tape parades, but, there wasn't television. There weren't the advertisement deals. There wasn't a Nike to do golf shoes or FootJoy, so it was a different situation. He said I had a family to feed and had a wife and a dad that were, he said, and I came to the realization that I was happy as a golfer, as an amateur, and I didn't want to be a professional. But, professional golfers back then, Harry Vardon, the stories about him not being, allowed in the clubs, that he was the head pro of because he wasn't, quote unquote, a gentleman. So there were a lot of those stories. So we did talk about it, what it was like, but he really demurred a lot of that. It was like, well, it was a long time ago, and, it was kind of fortunate, and I got a good break, and I was a good player, but I'm proud of what I accomplished. But I'm prouder of being a dad and what I've done in the legal profession and my education, and that was just one facet of his life.
One of the people that he worked with and alongside, and Dr. McKenzie, is obviously very strikes a strong chord with certainly us here in Victoria that are sandbelt golfers, because Dr. McKenzie had such a great influence on shaping what we now call sandbelt golf. Did you ever get any insight into his work with Alister McKenzie?
I did not.
No.
Well, this is one of those. It
Things.
Was sincere when I'm saying I wish I could go back. There's so many things I know now that would have been of interest that they just didn't come up, because most nights, honestly, I got there, I'd call ahead and tell the cook, just fix me a hamburger and, and you can leave. And so I choked down a hamburger, and if you couldn't, I actually preferred Pepsi, but in Atlanta, Georgia, Pepsi was a product that didn't exist because of Coca-Cola. So I'd have a Coke and a hamburger and exchange a few pleasantries and everything. And then I had homework I had to go do. And so
over that journey, Mel, how many times would you have played at Augusta?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I think John might remember, maybe, I don't know, 100.
Yeah, wow.
I don't know, maybe it was 75 or 50. I really don't remember, but it was any time I could drive 120 miles, and of course it's closed, from back then. It closed a couple of weeks after, so around the 1st of May Day, until September, it was closed because the grass that they had then was just ryegrass that was overseeded over the Bermuda. And, so once the temperature started going up and the humidity go up, ryegrass disappeared, and they didn't want to try to play it on Bermuda, so the course closed. So it was only open during the time I was going to school. Yeah, and as difficult as my major was, and I was double majoring in physics and aerospace engineering, and it was just, and I wasn't the most brilliant student.
So Mel, I've got an interesting. A little question for you from your experience. What do you think a November Masters is going to look like as far as the golf courses is concerned?
One, the azaleas won't be blooming. in that time of the year, it can be, more overcast in the fall than it is during the spring. So it wouldn't surprise me if it's a little wetter or muggier. And certainly the weather is going to be different.
Presumably they won't change the greens like I believe they do each year. So there'll be greens that are 2 years old, which will benefit certainly in terms of the firmness and the speed.
Well, they have the sub-air system under each green and under certain fairways, so they can pull moisture out, they can pump warm air in. And so I think their ability to get the golf course to be as close to what it is in April, there's no golf club in the world that will have the ability they have in order to replicate the conditions of April. It will look differently because, the dogwoods won't be blooming and the azaleas won't be blooming, but it's still a gorgeous golf course, even in the dead of winter. And Augusta, is on the, coastal town, in the southeastern part of the United States. So unlike Denver here, with 8 inches of snow on the ground today, it's a little different climate.
Mel, if you had to recall all of your Masters experiences, what are some of the key moments for you? What are your favourite memories that you recall on when you think about the Masters and what it means to you and just your connection with Augusta there?
Well, I remember very vividly that round of Ben Hogan's.
When you were in the tower at 18 there?
Well, no, after I actually followed him around and watched him shoot the 66 and then watched him hit balls afterwards. And I'd watch Gary Player practice, there at Ocean Reef and at the Masters. And they occasionally came, like I said, I live near Memphis, so they would come to the Memphis tournament occasionally. And so I marveled. I enjoyed more watching them on the range than I did playing the game, just because, to see the preciseness with which they struck the ball and the consistency of the trajectory and like Tiger hits the 9 shots with each club, a high hook, a high straight, high fade, and medium, and then low. I mean, and when he's done that, he moves to the next club, and Hogan could sit there and just hit these 4 irons with a ever so slight hook, and it was just remarkable to watch. And I was there when DiVincenzo signed the incorrect scorecard that Tommy Aaron had filled out, incorrectly.
Yeah, I find myself, I've only ever been to one major, and that was the Open at Troon in 2016. And if I reflect on my time there, I reckon I spent as much time, maybe not quite, but I spent a lot of time sitting on the beautiful stand that they erect behind the range, just watching everyone hit balls. And so I really feel that connection there, just watching the ball flights and watching them hit and listening for the sound that you articulated so beautifully when you were watching on the range there. So, yeah, unbelievable. Part 2, we switch over to Mel's other passion, and that's his passion of photography, but also his passion for global golf travel. He's one of the handfuls of guys that around the world that's played a number of the big top 100 lists. There's not too many places in the world that he hasn't been to for golf travel or golf play. It's always interesting to hear. Thanks for tuning in again. Look forward to hearing part 2 of the Mel Hughes story.